Personalist Manifestos is back from summer vacation. How have you been? I've missed you. Have you been taking care of yourself? I hope so. As we jump back into all things personalist, I am pleased to present to you the first of a 4-part seminar on disability and the church. These seminars were the result of a collaborative effort between the Lazarus Centre, Northwest College and Seminary, Fellowship Pacific, and this show. All groups I'm a part of in one way or another. I'm sharing these seminars with you because I don't want any discussion of disability we have on Personalist Manifestos to just be theoretical. I want them to lead to real, practical action. In the first seminar, my friend and colleague Krista Ewert presents on Disability Language and Rhetoric because, as you will see, this is a critical place to start when thinking about disability. And so with that, here's Krista.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Jessica and Jolene, for facilitating this and making this happen. I am the first of 4 talks on the series Disability Start Here, and you are not going to want to miss the other talks. Something that I really, really deeply value and love about the Lazarus Centre team is that we all come at this from a bit of a different angle. So today, I'm going to be setting the scene. I'm going to be giving you a bit of context. I won't lie, it's going to feel a little bit like a history lesson, but it's important to know how we got here. Why do we use the words that we use? Why do we have some of the mindsets and paradigms that we have? And then you're going to hear from the rest of the team. And to be honest, I can't remember if it's Michael or Greg next, but I love it how Michael, he's the academic. He comes at this from like an academic angle, a theological perspective. You've got Greg, who's got this biblical pastoral perspective, and then you've got Kathy, who's on the ground doing the practical work of how does this actually play out in our ministries and in our lives. So each of the sessions will build on each other. And I really do encourage you to take in all 4 because they work together. It gives not only depth of knowledge, but breadth of knowledge so that we can work towards having the church be a place where persons of all disabilities can thrive as disciples and ministers of the gospel. So my name is Krista Ewert. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Either I met you at Impact or maybe I haven't met you yet, but I am seeing some familiar faces from Impact as well as from other areas of life. Either you've attended a Lazarus Centre event before, and I work at Northwest College and Seminary actually as the Director of Advancement. So I'm not actually on the academic side, but my education is in the area of disability, language, and rhetoric, especially as it pertains to policy and legislation and how that policy shapes our societal perceptions of disability. But I have also worked in churches, which means that I come at everything from that lens of Christ, from ministry background. What does this actually look like in our lives as followers of Jesus? So that gives you a little snapshot of me. I'm going to tell you a little bit more in just a minute. But I wanted to start, and you're going to have to bear with me because I'm using somebody else's desk, so I'm getting used to their screen. So I might clunk around here, but I wanted to start by sharing a quote. And it says this: "Language and identity are so fundamentally intertwined. You peel back all the layers in terms of what we wear and what we eat and all the things that mark us. And in the end, what we have are our words." So it begs the question of who are we? I'd asked Jessica to pose that question to you because we usually have something back there, our elevator pitch for who we are, right? And sorry, you can make judgments about who I am by looking at me, but they might just be assumptions. They're a version of who I am. They're your version of who I am, and your sentiments towards me are going to be based on the connotations that you attach to the labels you have placed on me. So I've told you a little bit about my background. I can also tell you that I'm a wife. I am married to a choral conductor, which is a fun fact that people find interesting. Um, I'm a mother. I have three children. My middle daughter, Ella, she's 15. She has Down syndrome. I am Canadian. I say I'm almost as Canadian as you can get. My family came to Canada in 1815, so a very, very long time ago. I love food. I'm a foodie. I love to garden, and I'm a child of God. Now, there are other ways that people might describe me. Um, somebody might say that I'm a chink. My father certainly used that term, being Chinese himself, and hearing it when people were referring to him, but it doesn't change the fact that it's derogatory. The same goes for the term Oriental, that kind of comes from the colonial era. Um, some might say I'm like a mutt, like you'd compare me to a dog, but that doesn't quite sound right. Uh, Other words I've heard are like half-breed, but that's not really right either. Or some might say that I'm biracial or I'm mixed race, but for many people, that term still carries negative connotations. So let's just say I'm mixed ethnicity. I have lots of different cultures in my background. But I hope you can already see how language and identity, while undeniably connected, can pose some really big problems when the words we use are not created by those for whom they're intended to describe. Now, that being said, please note today that as a presenter, I am not myself disabled. I would not call myself disabled. I therefore offer any analysis and recommendations in a spirit of humility. And anything you take forward from here should be implemented in consultation with those who have lived experience of disability. I will say, however, I have experienced the disabling factors of society as I have helped my daughter Ella navigate her world. So I offer my perspective as a parent of a child with a disability, my experience as a disability rights activist, and my background as an interdisciplinary researcher in the area of disability over the last decade or so. Something else I'll just note before I dive into the material is that I talk mostly about people with intellectual disabilities. And while I believe that the term disability refers to both people with physical disabilities as well as intellectual disabilities, I feel that the latter are mislabeled and mistreated more commonly because of the language that has been inherited. That being said, both groups have been shaped by our cultural perceptions and misconceptions of bodily difference and alterity as a whole. And when I use the word alterity, I'll use it a couple times. I'm talking about anybody who's different or who's been labeled as other. I also have a little challenge for you as we go through this talk, and that is if you have a piece of paper handy and a pen, I'd love for you to write down all the words that you hear that are used in reference to persons with disabilities and see how many you end up with at the end. Okay, so going back to the quote, language and identity are so fundamentally intertwined. You peel back all the layers in terms of what we wear and what we eat and all the things that mark us. And in the end, what we have are our words. But what happens if you don't have words? What happens when the language used is not understood by the person it is meant to describe, or the words given don't accurately describe any part of the person they are meant to illustrate? What happens when the language inherited lacks dignity or has its origins from a long time ago? So while able-bodied and neurotypical individuals can make use of contemporary linguistic paradigms, and they can pick and choose what words they feel resonate with their lived experience and make sense of and give meaning to the places and circumstances of their past and present, persons with disabilities have been characterized, identified, and framed by language that has proven completely inadequate and usually defined by people ignorant of their realities. Throughout history, persons with disabilities, both physical and intellectual, have often had to rely on other people or technology to speak on their behalf. They have been silenced and misrepresented in their history, identity, and sense of belonging have been diminished. The words used to define them have not reflected who they are, but rather who others perceive them to be relative to the dominant values and paradigms of thought through history. So my goal now this afternoon, we're past 12, is to show you how the words that society has used to define, describe, and characterize persons with disabilities are the product of cultural authorities and dominant paradigms of thought that have changed with each century and are rooted in a long history of demeaning language and rhetoric. I'll trace the origins of disability language from the 18th century to the end of the 20th century to show how language and rhetoric both shape perceptions of disability throughout history as well as affect disability communities today. I'll focus primarily on the modern era. However, it is important to situate the 18th century disability language and rhetoric within the prevailing thought and use of language in the centuries leading up to it. So one really key shift to note is that prior to the 18th century, disability was understood within the interdependent language of church and state. On this slide, I'm not really going to touch on the first point, the intrinsic power to the extrinsic power, but it's something that I've been thinking about recently, where power shifted from think of the Pope, great example, where it used to be believed that Pope had intrinsic power, and that's how he had his position and role. But then it became extrinsic power, where it was the person in power was voted for or assigned that power as opposed to having it be intrinsic. But going back to sort of the church and state discussion, legislated by law and enabled by the church, the management of disability was carried out privately within the wider family or the wider parish community. And this notion of responsibility was disrupted by the growing separation of church and state by the end of the 17th century. And it resulted in significant paradigmatic shifts that both synthesized and challenged understandings and assumptions about God, reason, nature, and humanity. And that might be a territory that people are a little bit more familiar with, that separation of church and state. But the point is that a decisive shift occurred between faith and public life, wherein religion increasingly lost its status as a cultural authority and became a private matter. It made public life neutral regarding religion and allowed for reason, big capital R reason, to supersede the church as the public authority. So consequently, disability moved from being handled within the church and family to a matter of public life. And as we'll see in the 18th century, within this paradigm shift, it became all too easy for certain people to be pushed to the margins and or into institutions, which very much resembled prisons, because it seemed reasonable to do so. And as I will show, understanding the place of language and rhetoric in these changes is critical to understanding how we got to where we are. So let's move on to the 18th century. The 18th century was characterized by two distinct forces, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, or industrial capitalism, both of which impacted language pertaining to disability and subsequently societal perceptions and portrayals of persons of difference. So according to Enlightenment philosophy, to possess worth, one needed to be able to reason or rationally articulate an argument, and within the framework of the Industrial Revolution, one needed to be able to work to bring economic value to the community. Consequently, the terminology used to describe persons with disabilities reflected their inability to meet either of those conditions. No longer was their worth and identity contingent upon a God-given value as part of a community. Rather, worth was determined by someone's ability to contribute as an individual to an increasingly secularized public life. Enlightenment philosophy would say that citizenship requires the capacity to reason, and reason was determined by the capacity to demonstrate use of spoken and written language to prove the presence of rationality. We see that in if somebody cannot speak, if they are mute, then they would be called dumb. All this language is intertwined. And a lot of persons with especially intellectual disabilities did not have the ability to speak. They didn't have the early intervention that we have now, like speech therapy. So a lot of the times they would just end up being quiet, or they would have this unintelligible sort of way of speaking. Enlightenment thinkers suggested that there were three key prerequisites of being a citizen, and therefore somebody worthy of value, and in possession of rights. So those three criteria were, number one, they needed to consent to public authority. Number two, they needed to be able to cooperate with others. And number three, they needed to know the law so that they might exercise their own agency and political power. Some of you might be familiar with John Locke, who is known as one of the fathers of democracy and the author of the theory of natural right. And he was central to this movement. So his ideas informed political philosophy and modern concepts of what it means to be human. The language he used to describe persons with intellectual disabilities leaned into and perpetuated the negative stereotypes rooted in an individual's perceived lack of reason. His big publication was called Essay Concerning Human Understanding, and in it he wrestles with the role of what he calls idiots to play within the political framework, like what role they play in the political framework, since they lacked these universal maxims, these truths that everybody seemed to know, or knowledge or morals. Locke was an empiricist, and so he used these criteria to distinguish those who are worthy of equity and those who were not. So anybody who fell short of those criteria were then not considered equal. On the other hand, industrial capitalism emphasized production and a person's ability to work. Most importantly, it imposed a philosophical reorientation from life and work in community to life and work as an individual. In the 18th century, Britain experienced the decline of agriculture and feudal systems, and at the same time, an increase in commercial production as the result of industrial innovation. This emphasis on production led to the segregation of anyone who was unable to fulfill a satisfactory quota of work. Because of the physical demands of labor and intellectual ability required to complete a defined set of tasks, people with disabilities were often deemed to be without worth and without a place in society. The paradigm-shifting effects that resulted from the change in disability language and rhetoric that came about from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution have been long-lasting, like really long-lasting, and continue to shape our perception and praxis of disability today, or for disability today. a new cultural understanding of the value of a person as realized through their ability to reason and through their productivity, determined or validated worth and citizenship. And I would argue that Western society continues to subscribe to these notions today. I know I probably don't need to point this out, but this is problematic for a number of reasons. The first reason it's problematic is because it gives human, and therefore like finite reason, the authority to determine the worth of an individual and what makes their life worth living. We see this challenge manifested in debates such as medical assistance in dying and abortion. Each piece of legislation is rooted in the belief that those who are lacking in capacity, intellectual or physical, are well within their rights to retire in the most literal sense from participating in public life. The second reason this is really problematic is because the disability rhetoric used in the 18th century continues to influence our ideas of citizenship and, by extension, our ideas of belonging. Citizenship continues to be understood and defined as the state of being a member of a particular country and having rights because of it, or having membership in a community. They don't meet the criteria, they can't be a member of a community. They don't meet the criteria, they're denied their rights. Finally, this shift in disability rhetoric fostered a cultural understanding that meaningful contributions to a society needed to take the form of industrial productivity or that intellectual contribution. And we continue to see this in society, but I would also argue that we continue to see this in the church. If you can do a lot of stuff, churches love you. If you can volunteer on lots of different committees, churches love you. If you can speak articulately from the pulpit, churches love you. Okay, that's the 18th century. Now we're going to move on to the 19th century. How did things change in the 19th century? So disability language significantly changed in the 19th century to reflect the authoritative role of an evolving medical landscape, and also continues to inform the way we speak about disability in a dominantly medicalized way to this day. As a result of a new interest in statistics and surveillance, the 19th century saw a number of cascading pieces of legislation that intertwined the medical discipline, that intertwined with the medical discipline for the care of persons of difference. So physicians, psychiatrists, lawyers, and scientists, think of people like Charles Darwin, were publishing scholarship that identified, characterized, and cataloged all living things. As part of this, perceived deviations were recorded, which necessitated a new set of language and consequently provided the framework for what we now know today as the medical model of disability. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a man named Adolf Quetelet, who was the first statistician to articulate the concept of normal. So 19th century, not that long ago, he just then articulated the concept of normal by applying the law of error used by astronomers. He applied the law to human features to create the concept of l'homme moyen, or the average man. The theory of normative thinking suggests that the majority of the population must fit within the norm, or situate themselves on the arc of a standard bell-shaped curve. So that top part of the curve, that is normal. That is where we get the term normal from. The perception of normal then informed a new way of cataloging and categorizing disability that continues to be built out today. For some, like Darwin, it was primarily an ecological or biological endeavor, but for others, such as François-Manuel Fauderay, a French forensic physician, there was a belief that, end quote, that he said, medicine would bring the law a new scientific exactness, a medicalized light shining from the reason of the Enlightenment. Doesn't that sound elegant? End quote. Fodere divided monsters, that's a quote, monsters among the human race, into three categories, all centered around their ability to reason and perform tasks. By grounding his classifications in performance of tasks, Fodere demonstrates his commitment to the ideas of the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, the first was this group called Wondrous Divinity. I'm not sure where he got these names, but these individuals lacked simplest association of ideas and would repeat words meaninglessly, so demonstrating that lack of reason. The second group could manage simple tasks, equivalent to a 7-year-old, so the lack of production. And finally, the third group, with some rudimentary education, could form slightly better ideas, so demonstrating that inferior reason. There was also a strong emphasis in the 19th century on discerning the cause of the deviation from quote unquote normal and the classification thereof. Scientists such as John Langdon Down, who was the superintendent of the world's first idiot asylum at Earlswood, England, tested theories linking physiological features to ethnic phenotypes, while others investigated links to socioeconomic status. So I'm just going to take a minute and take Down syndrome as an example. In his publication, The Ethnic Classification of Idiots, which was published in 1867, Down described those associated with the Mongolian family. He went on to list the characteristics of these individuals: a flat, broad face, eyes obliquely placed, a very narrow palpable fissure, a long, thick, and rough tongue, a small nose, etc. He named these individuals Mongols, a term that was used until the early 1970s to describe what we now know as Down syndrome. And actually, we do still use the word Down syndrome very commonly, but there's also the term trisomy 21, which describes the genetic variation instead. But this Down syndrome obviously was named after John Langdon Down himself. Now, by distinguishing Down syndrome in this way, Down was implying that the traits outside of the British archetype were unacceptable or less than ideal. These people did not look like the average British person, the normal British person. The work of categorizing and cataloging difference continues today, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, or the DSM-5, continues to be an authority in the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness and intellectual disability, thus perpetuating the medical model of understanding bodily difference. Psychiatrists who in the 19th century, like this is a brand new field, they were called alienists, formed another branch of medical scientists engaged in shaping new language concerning disability within the 19th century. It's really interesting to note that psychiatry, as I said, was a brand new field, and the experts, so the people whose language we use today, had no specialized training pertaining to persons with disabilities at the time. Some of them didn't even have medical degrees. Advancement in medicine, especially within the new field of psychiatry, brought about this huge instability to disability language due to the unverified nature of the conclusions being drawn about bodily and intellectual differences. Consequently, their linguistic legacy is a canon that was largely dehumanizing in its implications. It generated a perception that people who were abnormal were less than or other than human, and created societal segregation, which continues to be reinforced within our communities and institutions. Okay, moving on to the 20th century. The rise in evolutionary thinking and the concept of hierarchies dominated the 20th century, and it gave way to new ideas about how to manage, eliminate, and eventually rehabilitate disability. In the 20th century, the science of eugenics promoted the need to improve racial stock. Then you had evolutionary psychology that attempted to demonstrate the link between non-human animal and human consciousness, using intellectual disability as an answer to fill the gap or the missing link. Finally, rehabilitation further demeaned the disabled population as post-World War II medical science and its accompanying vocabulary sought to return bodies to normal. So let me dive into each one of those a little bit more. Eugenics took the societal anxieties around disability in the 19th century and built upon them, promoting the idea that not only were people with disabilities a threat to the moral order, but they were also a threat to the human race. Eugenics, the science of improving the genetic quality of human race, was developed by a man by the name of Francis Galton. And he in turn motivated some of Darwin's work. But Galton asserted in his publication, Hereditary Genius, that heredity, as opposed to environment, was a key factor in human differences. He hypothesized that if by careful selection farmers could breed strong animals, then the human race could do the same. Ultimately, he believed it was possible to have a higher order of personality through the elimination or institutionalization of weak people and the privileging and procreation of strong people. And if you think this idea is ridiculous and passé, I mean, you can just watch a movie like Gattaca, which when I put that in my notes, I realized actually how long ago Gattaca came out, and I'm dating myself. But really fascinating. If you haven't seen the movie Gattaca, you might want to take a look. Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman. Okay, moving on to evolutionary psychology. This complemented the theory of eugenics in that it viewed the deficient person as a product of the failure to evolve in the first place. So Darwin argued man evolved from lower life forms, not only physically, but mentally as well. I think we've all heard these sorts of things. He asserted that there was a narrow consciousness gap between humans and animals, with idiots bridging that gap. Darwin pointed out that idiots as a lesser form of humanity were simply less evolved, similar to many depictions of savages who, in Darwin's opinions, shared characteristics with that of primates. The savages that I speak of, this was like in the area of colonialism, and there was lots of world exploration going on. And so the savages were the other cultures that they would encounter, like when traveling to Africa or traveling to South America. So to prevent the continuation of conditions such as Down syndrome and others like it, sterilization became a very common practice and was even made compulsory in some institutions and countries as the movement to eradicate mental deficiency began to gain momentum. And we see very similar things today. So, for example, in Iceland, they claimed to have eradicated Down syndrome, but all that means is they aborted all of the babies who were diagnosed with Down syndrome. The practice of eugenics or race hygiene, called Rassenhygiene, I'm not German, I'm sorry, I probably slaughtered that, was most aggressively implemented when the National Socialist Party in Germany came to power in 1933, with the ideology built on the premise that the human stock must be purified from all of those unworthy of life. Sounding familiar? During the Nazi period, so between 1933 and 1945, around 400,000 people were sterilized, and between 5,000 and 25,000 children were killed under a program implementing the mercy killing of Auschkinder, or garbage children. And around 80,000 people with disabilities, both physical and intellectual, were gassed to death. 80,000 people. At the start of the 20th century, persons with disabilities were perceived as a threat to the human stock on the grounds of developments in eugenics and evolutionary psychology. The language used hinged on the principles of statistics and science. In 1910, Goddard proposed a new categorization of idiots based on their IQs. So idiots who had an IQ of 0 to 25, there were imbeciles who were in the range of like 26 to 50, and then there was a new category labeled morons, from the Greek word for foolish, who ranged from 51 to 70. Goddard advocated for the incarceration and sterilization of all three groups. We continue to use IQ tests today, and they're sometimes referred to as psych ed assessments, where not only is the amount of funding given to a family in Canada is based upon these IQ scores, but also children with disabilities are segregated based on their IQs in the school system. And I've experienced both of these things personally through the experience of my daughter. Prior to World War II, this is moving into the rehabilitation piece. Prior to World War II, disability was something to be feared and eliminated, or at least to hide away. But after the war, the perception was that the war had caused damage. It had taken away that which needed to be replaced, right? Because you had all of these soldiers, these heroes coming back injured. Maybe, they lost an arm, or they had PTSD, or there were all sorts of things that veterans came back with. Thus, the development of prothesis. Henri Steiker, he's a leading disability historian, summarized it this way. It is here that we can see the break between the two eras. The war injured will take the place of the disabled. The image of disability will become one of insufficiency to be made good, a deficiency to eradicate, end quote. This shift strongly influenced the language we use when referring to disability. So, for example, the word handicap was introduced to address any disability that might hinder someone. The term originally came from a game called Hand in Cap, in which every player would have an equal chance at winning. Later, it was applied to horse racing when they would handicap the fastest horse by hanging rocks around its neck. Eventually, the term was used to describe somebody who is handicapped in the race for life. The word itself implies that handicap is something to overcome. It wasn't until the 1970s and the first wave of the disability rights movement happened that legislation began recognizing people with disabilities as worthy of human rights. It's during this time that we start to see the word disability actually become popularized. Around the same time, the term retardation began appearing in clinic and legislative documentation, especially as it pertained to education. The term retarded means, quote, to make slow, delay, keep back, or hinder, end quote, and began replacing words such as idiot or imbecile. While it first appeared in 1895, introduced by a neurologist named Alfred Strauss to describe children with endogenous, so like largely genetic delayed development due to an inherited defect, the word retarded did not actually become popular in legislation or social contexts until the mid-20th century. Similar to the terms it replaced, however, retarded eventually became derogatory and highly offensive. If there's one thing you take away from today, please don't use that word ever. While some may argue that the 20th century had the greatest reforms or progress in the area of disability and language, the new ways of thinking from rehabilitation to the disability rights movement and language created as a result continued to be dictated by the cultural authority and dominant social narrative. The language of eugenics promoted disability as a liability because it was a threat to human stock. The language of evolutionary psychology determined intellectual disability as liminal And having bridged the gap between animal and human, it treated the disabled person as dispensable. And rehabilitation deemed disability as temporary and just in need of correction. So I hope that I have evidenced for you that within each century, a different cultural authority, so medical, political, religious, has given power to the language it created to define, describe, and characterize people with disabilities. The human representatives of those authorities, so the priests, the lawyers, the scientists, the physicians, in turn pronounced judgment upon individuals as idiots, morons, imbeciles, feeble-minded, handicapped, retarded, or disabled. And what we're left with is an unstable and inconsistent language that fails to fully realize the humanity and fullness of a person. In 21st century language, the term normal continues to be a measure of the way we process the world around us, from our height to social behavior. Yet despite the endless realm of classification, we have now discovered that really there's no such thing as normal. Normal has also, since its inception, implied that anything outside of normal is negative, which is not the case. We must choose other words that disassociate perception with fact, so that instead of something being abnormal, it may just be different, or instead of being a defect, consider that it might just be a simple variation. In every century, the dominant paradigm of thought positioned disability as less than and dependent on an able-bodied counterpart with no reciprocity. Language is more than just words. Language is directly related to power. As Michel Foucault asked, quote, "What is being said in what is being said?" End quote. If a language creates distinction and alterity and is the result of power, there is this, quote, "fear of alterity when it embodies profound distortion, but also pleasure in alterity when it reveals the other face of society and its powers," end quote. Alterity is represented in language holding the question of who gets to speak, who shapes rhetorical interaction, and how do we read bodies. We must consider who or what held the power as the creators, inventors, and gatekeepers of language in the modern West. And what does this say about the legacy of language we are left with and the collective identity of a people group who were unable to choose the words that would be used to tell their stories after they were gone? I propose that we stop allowing trends in society, science, and stereotypes to govern the language we use and give meaning to our identities, communities, and belonging. By tracing the evolution of language used in legislation, philosophy, science, and literature, referring to and representing persons with disabilities through the 18th century until present day, it is possible to gain an understanding of the origin of the dehumanization of persons with disabilities and the means by which their differences were defined. Ultimately, language is only a symptom of a deeper longing to conform and dominate what is culturally dominant. I'm going to say that one more time. Language is only a symptom of a deeper longing to conform and dominate what is culturally dominant. As society, we have continually tried to supersede God, to control the world around us, ourselves, and others by harnessing the idols of our time, be it philosophy, science, or social justice through knowledge, power, and language. As individuals, we try to rule over and control one another, acting in direct contrast to our calling as God's children. We have been striving since the very beginning of time to perfect humanity, to progress, and to save ourselves by our own means and not by the sanctification and redemption that can only come from God. And in doing so, we have diminished those who hinder us in our endeavor: the weak, the prisoner, the orphan, the widow, refugees, and persons with bodily differences, genetic variations, or neurodiversity. The kingdom of God, however, speaks of a different way. How can we reflect on and embrace God's love and care for all his creation in the language and rhetoric we use? Only in understanding why we use the language we do and the circumstances from which it originated can we begin to think outside of the rhetorical box. Returning to a sacred view of human life, we must ground ourselves in the truth that God made all of his creation for his glory. The story of creation paints so clearly God's heart and his love for his people. It was a blank canvas to create the world exactly as he desired. So it's really interesting that God did not choose to create a homogeneous, monochromatic world with uniformity, but rather a diverse and colorful world full of contrasts and juxtaposition. He created light and dark, night and day, waters, land, man, woman, beast, insect, and then he gave his creation meaning and significance by having Adam, whom he named, in turn name every tree, fruit, fish, and bird. There is an innate bond between the namer and the named. Just think of a parent giving a child a name. Giving a name bestows a uniqueness upon an object or a person. We learn that in Genesis 2. Naming also has the ability, however, when done from a position of power, to exclude and discriminate against the other. In the story of creation, however, naming establishes the significance of difference, and as God said, it was really good. Okay, I added the really. No two people are the same. And God formed each one of us, carefully knitting us together in our mother's wombs. He views each person as body, mind, heart, and soul. Oftentimes, the names given to persons of historical difference, disabled or otherwise, describe only one aspect of that person, not the whole. And furthermore, the language used in describing persons with disabilities often carries stigma or negative associations. Unfortunately, because of the fall, humanity was separated from God and relationships were broken. Man and woman no longer recognized God in the other, nor did they view diversity as a reflection of God's glory, but rather as a threat to comfort, stability, and advancement. It is no surprise then that God is so concerned with reconciliation and why he sent his son to be a minister of reconciliation. Ever since that moment when the serpent deceived God's children, he has been on a mission to reconcile creation back to himself and bring humanity to a state of wholeness once again. So, for this reason, biblical accounts of healing are not just demonstrations of God's power, but also an act of reconciling the relationship between God and his people. More often than not, acts of healing in the New Testament give the person being healed access to the gospel and bring them closer to wholeness that can only be realized in the fullness of Christ. We only know the names of two individuals healed in the New Testament. There's blind Bartimaeus and Lazarus. Lazarus in Greek means God helped. As a church, we too must recognize our complete dependence on God and our need for God as a helper, advocate, creator, and father as we collectively represent Imago Dei. In other words, we cannot fully know God without seeing God in the other. not just the able-bodied, articulate, or intelligent members of our congregations, but in everyone, because we are all made in the image of God and all in need of a Savior. So my hope today is that this presentation serves as the start of a conversation so that together we can reimagine a kingdom language that holds both our brokenness as well as our identity as children of God, made in the image of God. So the two questions are, can you think of a time when you were in a situation when you didn't know what words to use when referring to a person with a disability? And can you think of a word that someone else used when referring to a person with a disability that made you uncomfortable, or maybe that you didn't know? And I really want to encourage you. Part of the beauty of this conversation is, I was saying to Jessica and Jolene, like, I'm not very smooth. I'm not an academic, so I don't present like all the time. But the whole point of the Lazarus Centre conversation is making space for us to just be ourselves and admit where we don't know things and ask questions and learn from each other. So I hope that you will be honest with each other, and it's okay to not have all the answers.